I was reading a little bit about how Ethiopia has been impacted by climate change. We are impacted greatly. And then we also are contributing to the greenhouse gas emissions. And I read a little bit more about that. And part of the greenhouse gas emissions that we contribute to comes from what we call AFOLO, or it's agricultural, forest, and other land uses. It contributes roughly about 61% of the greenhouse gas emissions that we put to the atmosphere. And of that, 40% of that comes from livestock. It's kind of interesting. And what happens is livestock releases methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas emissions. And it's 28 times stronger than carbon dioxide over a 100-year span. And basically it's cattle belch that causes the greenhouse gas emissions, or what we call the methane releases, which is basically the cow burping and not being able to control the manure. And also I was reading another article recently which really caught my eye. Equity female staff paid 52% below men in the same positions. It's an oxymoron. Equity is the bank in Kenya, and they've been doing their ESG auditing, and they found that female staff have been paid 52% less for doing the same job as men. So we have similar issues that we need to address. So with that, I would like to invite our colleague from FSD Africa, Vimal Parmar, to come to the podium and give us a presentation on ES and sustainability, or environmental, social, and sustainability. So Vimal is a specialist capital market specialist, senior capital market specialist at FSD Africa. He's also a fellow CFA charter holder, like myself. Let's welcome Vimal to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. So there have been very good introductions about ESG that we have seen being given by our former speakers. I will try to make this presentation as interesting as possible for you to understand. The main theme of the knowledge series is shaping the ESG agenda for Ethiopia. So we are very much supportive of this with all the market stakeholders who are present, as well as in other African markets. So I'll just start with the outline of my presentation will be, one is looking at the perception of ESG. So this is basically what people think about ESG. The perception can be different from what ESG actually could be. Then I'll briefly talk about what ESG is and in the introduction of it, why ESG standards are necessary. We have seen the Abe speak about some of these aspects of it, and what are some of the considerations, especially from the regulators and the government as well. I'll also speak about a case study in Ethiopia, which has taken up ESG standards, and some of the recommendations that we can have for the Ethiopian market to consider, especially to develop the ESG market. So what is the perception of ESG? Mostly we have seen that people think about ESG as how we can measure good companies, or how useful is it to measure? How do you know whether a company is good or not good? But then, to measure those things, do we have clear standards? Are these harmonized across the various stakeholders? There is also a bit of confusion between ESG and sustainability. Sometimes people use ESG interchangeably with sustainability. So are these terms interchangeable? And does ESG really matter? You know, this concept has been discussed in various events, various conferences, but have we actually seen the impacts of ESG, at least in those institutions or countries where ESG has been implemented? So I'll just talk briefly about what the perception has been and what has been reported. So nearly 70% of business leaders think that ESG is essential. I'm not sure whether it is very clear. Nearly 70% of businesses which have been surveyed think that ESG is very essential for good business. And it's also dependent on the environmental and social aspects. We have seen that climate action, people have spoken about poverty reduction, as well as the social aspect, you know, including gender and women. Fasil spoke about the gender gap that we had mentioned in Equity Bank, which is operating in Kenya. So that is the social aspect. And then obviously is also the governance of this. How is it all managed? What are the roles and responsibilities of the different stakeholders and institutions who are looking into this? And ESG also has a very good investment angle in attracting sustainable investment capital. And I bring the word here sustainable because in Africa mostly we are relying on aid or our local funding from the government, which is sometimes not enough. We have our own economic deficits that we are running. So how can this become more sustainable? And globally we have seen billions of dollars is being made available for investments into such kind of projects or initiatives. And you know, even if 1% of those billions of dollars can come to Africa, you know, we are talking about more than 900 billion. So if 1%, that's $9 billion or even more coming to Africa, that can make a huge difference to not only our countries, but also to the people. And then there's also this perception that ESG is a compliance burden. So is it really a compliance burden that you have to do a lot of administrative compliance reporting? So also that is a perception that is in the market, but the benefits are much more and they outweigh the tasks that are involved in reporting itself. So why has ESG, you know, continued to rise globally? What are the main factors which are causing this rise, and how is this being brought about? One of the things we mentioned is there's concerns about climate change that we have already seen. But there's also a new aspect of corporate sustainability. Many corporates, we have seen that who have been ongoing concerns, they are unable to sustain themselves after some time, mainly because they have overlooked the ESG aspects, or mainly the G or the S aspects in the organizations. And this becomes very tricky because what we have is there's a rise of social business and bottom of the pyramid thinking. So mostly the people at the higher level of the pyramids are being considered, but the mass market, which is at the lower level of the pyramid, are being ignored. And that is what is being not considered when business sustainability is concerned. And this is why it's one of the major forces which is causing the rise of ESG in our market. There is also a growing awareness in terms of diversity and inclusion. We mentioned about the gender inequalities. It is very important to include our partners, women businesses and the like, into our businesses for sustainability. And this is from my personal experience. You might accept it or not, but I have noticed that when a woman is being given the driver's seat to run some of these initiatives, they sustain it for generations. But on the other hand, it doesn't happen always when a man is doing so. And that is because the woman, you know, her nature is it's nurturing. So she nurtures not only the current generation, but also the next generations to come. So that is why it is one of the social aspects in the ESG which is very important for us to consider. There are also regulatory processes and demands from long-term investors. As I mentioned, new regulations are being drafted, or guidelines, which I'll speak about in our other slides, on ESG and how these can be incorporated not only in businesses but also from an investment perspective. We have a lot of investors who are now specifically having capital for ESG specific investments only. So, you know, the conventional way of investing is kind of drying out slowly. It is still there because those products are in the market. But I think in the next 10 to 20 years, we will see there'll be more products in the market which are looking at the ESG aspects, the green aspects, and the sustainability aspects. And that is why we have seen ESG is now taking shape in different markets. So just to give a brief what ESG is, I think some of my former speakers have already spoken about it, is mainly to balance economic value creation with an ESG approach, which is more holistic. So on the environmental side, you know, we have climate change, we have biodiversity, energy efficiency, water scarcity, waste management. All these things have been overlooked. If you see in the last 10 years or 20 years or even more, there has been no attention given to waste management. We see waste being dumped anywhere. Water scarcity has been a problem. Everywhere, not only in Ethiopia, but in Africa, we see that water tanks are being used to preserve water for future needs. And that is because of the scarcity. Then there is the social aspect, which is not only on the gender side, which I mentioned previously, but also it's on the customer satisfaction. And also on the human rights and labor, and employee engagement as well. In the past, most companies never used to engage their junior employees in some of the decision makers. It was mainly being done by the senior leadership team. But now this is changing. The junior employees, who are also the main driving force behind the company, are being consulted and engaged. So that is why the social aspect is becoming more important, and inclusivity is becoming a key component in business sustainability. And finally, the G is the governance aspect, which is mostly people have thought that the G is mainly on the board side, the senior leadership, but it is more to that. It is also including political contributions, whistleblowing, bribery and corruption, which have been overlooked. And this is very important for us to look when we are looking at the ESG side. So basically, ESG standards look for all kind of stakeholders. So whether you are an employee, whether you are a customer, whether you are a CEO, or whether you are a director, it applies to everyone. And it's mainly to maximize the economic, environment, and social value in an organization. It also looks at ethical practices that we have always overlooked in running our organizations. So why are ESG standards necessary, especially even for reporting entities? One is on the risk assessment. We have seen that various kind of risks have emerged. We only know of the past risks which are related to the company risk, the political risk, the economic risk, but there are new risks which have emerged, which is on the environmental risks, the social risks, the governance risks. So the ESG metrics really help in looking at a holistic approach to the risks which have been previously overlooked. There is the long-term value creation and resilience as well. This is mainly on the shareholder perspective. We have stakeholder expectations and also on the regulatory compliance, which is the oversight or the supervision bodies. I won't go through all of this, but it mainly talks about why sustainability and longevity in business is important when we are looking at the ESG. It promotes better pricing and better shareholder value. On the ESG framework, I will not talk more about this. I know my next colleague is going to speak about the ESG framework, which is going to identify the factors and what are the considerations when someone is developing an ESG framework, not only for the country but also for the company. How are the ESG companies or institutions benefiting? So one is there's a lot of adaptability and resilience, especially with the new technologies which are coming up. And it also helps in cost reductions over time. So we have seen profits, companies using ESG metrics, their profits have grown much better than companies who are not using. Obviously, the key question here will be, where is the evidence? But this is still a new concept, and it is starting across the global space, and especially in Africa. Improved productivity and regulatory and legal interventions. We have seen some countries providing incentives and subsidies when it comes to adoption of ESG standards. And also on the reporting side, so as one of my former speakers said, it is just not looking at profits, but it is looking at the profits, the planet, and the people as a whole. And the planet and the people was missing before. It was all about profits. So these are some of the sustainable goals, and ESG adoption is a sure way to attain these. We have 17 goals, and obviously poverty reduction is number one. We have good health, gender equality, clean water, sanitation, and the rest. So what are some of the considerations from the government and the regulators that are very important? Creating a regulatory framework which is supporting ESG investments is really critical. And this is for promoting transparency, accountability, and also collaboration with all market stakeholders. They provide the oversight and the supervision so that anyone cannot just claim that we are adhering to ESG standards, but they are supervised to ensure that they are actually adhering to the ESG standards. On the role of mainly on the policy makers now, it's very important to create that awareness and formulation of guidelines, because this is a new concept, people are not aware of it. So various capacity building trainings are also important, and also to provide leadership. People like following after they have seen that something is working. Otherwise, if it's not working, no one is really going to take it up and own it. So the ownership can only be catalyzed when there's a proof of concept in the market that it is actually working. So in Ethiopia, ESG standards have been adopted by the Sustainable Textile Investment and Operations in Ethiopia, which is a program in collaboration with the Chinese and the government investors. Many African countries have not prioritized this yet, but there is a lot of happening in the African continent, which I'll show you on the next slide. And this is quite encouraging because people are taking the lead. They want to be leaders. They want their countries to be leaders in this and raising their profile, which is going to not only attract long-term sustainable capital for investments, but also attract business operations to be more sustainable going forward, create jobs, and also help in poverty reduction. So just briefly about why Africa. Ethiopia is in Africa, and why Africa. To manage resources sustainably, ESG has to be inculcated into each and every aspect of the business, whether it is operations, whether it is finance, whether it is marketing, or whether it is investment or shareholder value. And Africa is a great continent. We have a population of more than 1.2 billion, and we have the natural resources and the capital as well. So we can really tap into this and make a lot of noise about this when we are successful. But if we don't take the first step, then we cannot really show the world that Africa can also do this. Also, there is another case study that I've included, the Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative. So globally, 70 stock exchanges have written guidelines on ESG investing. And this has seen a lot of changes in attracting a lot of capital into those countries from various parts of the world into the exchange. It can either be private capital or it can also be public capital. And in Africa especially, just to mention some of the markets, Ghana, Kenya, Botswana, Morocco, Namibia, Nigeria, South Africa, they are already working on some of these things. Some of them already have guidelines. Personally, I'm currently leading on an initiative on ESG guidelines for pensions sector in Kenya, Ghana, and Nigeria. And we are also developing a toolkit, which is like a guideline on how these pensions investors can actually adopt ESG into their investments. So this map is just a summary of showing where countries have actually adopted the ESG. So we can see in Nigeria, there are various ESG guidelines and regulations which have been adopted by the Central Bank of Nigeria on the sustainable banking principles. In South Africa also, we have various codes such as the GRI, which have been adopted. In Kenya, we have the exchange, we have the central bank, and we have the Kenya Bankers Association also, which have now the guidelines on ESG. And the other markets which I mentioned, Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, they are also looking at ESG or incorporating ESG into their markets by creating various capacity building, awareness, and also product-related trainings for the market and the stakeholders, not only working with the private sector, but also working with the government and the public sector as well. A very good example, I know the Ethiopian market is very big in real estate, and I put this intentionally because we supported Aecon Holdings, which raised millions of US dollars in capital, and they used the GREST standard, which is a global framework, which mainly assesses and benchmarks against the ESG in terms of performance of real estate assets and infrastructure. This is a student accommodation, and the company raised more than $75 million in 2 tranches, and now they have already paid back all that capital or part of that capital within less than 5 years, which is already giving them a lot of profile raising. They were also listed on the London Stock Exchange. So you can imagine the kind of capital and investors that they've attracted. And if they have to come back to the market for another similar product which is looking at ESG, they will definitely get the cash or the investments very quickly. So it is very important that companies start looking at ESG as early as they can. I will not go into details about this because the main aim is to embrace and integrate ESG, as I mentioned, into various business processes, collaborate with all the market stakeholders to ensure there is transparency, and obviously the disclosure requirements. The more you are able to disclose about ESG to investors, the more attractive it becomes as an investment. So ESG action is mainly you have to understand what ESG is, then design the frameworks, which includes the metrics, the targets, including all the stakeholders, and then you activate it. And by activation, it means the governance and risk management and the reporting and the assurance standards. I'll not go into details about this, but at the end is you want to showcase your sustainability and ESG story to the world. And once you do that, you come into the limelight, and there's a long-term sustainable capital which you can attract. And there's a lot out there which we are probably missing out as Ethiopians. These are just some of the frameworks and standards which have been developed globally. Some of these were mentioned, the TCFD, ISSP, so I will not go through that. But they are also the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact. These are some of the institutions which are just their logos and the green taxonomies that you're using. So I would like to end the presentation with some of the recommendations on why ESG is important. One is you need to set up policies or regulations, because without the policies and regulations, there is lack of understanding, there is lack of awareness. And financial authorities have greater oversight. So for example, how would you know that one company is better managing their ESG strategy than the other? And that's why we have rating agencies who can provide this oversight and monitoring. Standardization, we cannot have one ESG guideline for a certain sector and another one for another sector. It has to work across the board on various sectors. And that's why we need harmonization of these policies and regulations. And regulators should work on getting rid of the disincentives which are leading as barriers to adopting ESG. What are some of these things or products in the market which are not helping ESG to be taken up? Regulators should actually support products which are looking at the ESG aspects as well and promoting that not only for the country but also for the people. But also on long-term sustainability and developing capacity, which I mentioned earlier. We've always talked about sustainability, but it doesn't really happen because we have not incorporated, we have not owned this into our systems. We have not owned this into ourselves. We talk about it a lot, but ownership is a big problem. So I think ownership is very critical, and when you own it, it has to be implemented, and you have to hold the hand for it to work. Without that ownership, we will not see much success. And it is very important for companies to include that in their strategies as well. As I mentioned, you develop a purposeful culture in your whole organization. So not only ignoring even the junior employees, but you also incorporate them and get their views because they know what is happening on the ground. And this creates a brand for you. You can imagine if one company is the first company which issues, for example, a sustainable bond in Ethiopia. Can you imagine the amount of limelight, the amount of profile raising it will get globally? Just one company? And others will follow because it's going to attract a lot of capital for it. And you have to clearly articulate the value proposition, why ESG is important. You have to walk the talk. Just mentioning about ESG doesn't change anything, Once we are out of this room, okay, yeah, we've learned a bit about ESG, but are we looking at implementing or executing or owning that into our businesses is very important. So that is in brief about ESG. Thank you very much for listening to me.